I was finishing a stack of overdue reports late in the evening, the kind that make your eyes blur and your shoulders stiff, when my phone began to vibrate across the desk with that familiar, impatient buzz. The screen showed my spouse's name, and for a moment I assumed it was something simple. Maybe she needed me to bring over a charger or unlock the garage remotely, because she was supposed to be at one of her regular social gatherings across the street. Before I could even say hello, I heard loud, careless laughter bleeding through the speaker, the kind that comes from too much cheap wine and too little self-awareness. When I finally spoke, her voice didn't come back to me in the private, familiar way it usually did. Instead, it rang out like she was addressing a crowd. She told everyone to quiet down because she had an announcement, stretching the word as if she were on a stage instead of calling her husband. That was when it hit me that I was on speaker, that I was no longer part of a conversation but a prop in a performance. The background noise faded into a tense hush, and I could almost picture a circle of faces leaning in, waiting for something dramatic. Then she said, with exaggerated calm and theatrical flair, that she had been doing a lot of thinking and had decided we were finished, completely and permanently, that our marriage was over. The silence that followed felt heavy, like air before a storm, before it shattered into shocked whispers and nervous reactions from her audience. I sat there, phone in hand, trying to understand how a relationship measured in years could be reduced to a punchline delivered for entertainment. And in that moment, something in me quietly, finally snapped into place. For several seconds, I didn't speak at all, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I was suddenly very aware that whatever I said would become part of her show. I had spent years being the invisible character in her stories, the dull husband who didn't do enough, who didn't say the right things, who didn't live up to the dramatic version of life she liked to perform for her friends. I'd heard my flaws exaggerated and recycled so many times that I'd started to believe some of them myself. But this was different. This wasn't a complaint wrapped in humor or a sarcastic anecdote. This was a public execution of something that was supposed to be private and protected. I imagined the faces in that room, waiting for me to beg or argue, waiting for tears or anger so the night could have a climax worth remembering. Instead, I kept my voice level and brief, said that I understood, wished her well, and ended the call. The line went dead, and the house around me felt strangely quiet, like a theater after the audience leaves. I set the phone down and stared at my computer screen, pretending to read emails while my thoughts raced ahead, already lining up decisions I'd been avoiding for years. When someone shows you exactly how little they value you, the worst thing you can do is pretend you didn't see it. That night, I didn't pace or drink or call anyone for advice. I opened my laptop and started treating the situation the way I treated any serious problem, methodically. We kept our finances mostly separate, but there were still loose threads connecting our lives, little conveniences that suddenly felt like liabilities. She had access to one of my cards for her shopping trips, and her parent had another for what were always described as emergencies, but somehow turned into regular errands. I logged into my accounts, removed every shared permission, canceled every linked card, and changed every password to something she couldn't guess. I added extra security steps, called the bank, and made sure no one could quietly undo what I'd just done. My phone kept lighting up with messages, but I didn't check any of them. I wasn't angry in the explosive way people expect. I was focused, and that scared me more than any shouting match ever had. By the time I moved on to the streaming services and online shopping accounts, it was well past midnight, and I felt oddly calm clicking through each setting and resetting each access point, like I was finally closing doors that should have been closed a long time ago. I canceled the premium channels she insisted were essential and downgraded everything else to the basics, not out of spite but out of clarity. If she wanted independence badly enough to announce it like a headline, she could start paying for it herself. When I finally went to bed, the house felt lighter, as if something heavy had been quietly carried out while I wasn't looking. I slept better than I had in months, and when morning came, I woke up without that familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. The phone started ringing before I'd finished my first cup of coffee, and I let it ring, then ring again, until eventually I answered a number I recognized all too well. The voice on the other end wasn't calm or curious. It was furious and embarrassed, demanding to know why a card had been declined in the middle of a crowded store. I listened, took another sip of coffee, and explained in the simplest terms possible that when someone ends a marriage, the benefits of being part of that marriage tend to end as well. There was shouting in the background, arguments muffled by distance, and then more accusations, but I ended that call the same way I'd ended the first one, decisively and without apology. By midday, I had blocked every number that was trying to drag me back into a conversation that had already been settled the moment she turned our private life into public entertainment. I was sitting at my desk when I noticed movement outside and saw her standing on the front step, trying her key, looking confused when it didn't work. I'd had the locks changed that morning, not in a fit of anger, but in the same practical way you fix a door after someone tells you they're done living in the house. She knocked, then pounded, then shouted my name like volume could undo decisions. When I opened the door, I didn't invite her in. She looked exhausted, makeup smeared, clothes rumpled, like someone who'd run out of adrenaline and was finally feeling the crash. She accused me of humiliating her, and for a moment I almost laughed at the irony, but I didn't. I reminded her calmly that she had taken care of the humiliation all by herself, with an audience. She tried to brush it off as a joke, as something said in the heat of the moment, but I told her that moments reveal priorities, and hers had been very clear. She tried to step inside, and I stepped back and closed the space between us with the door. She argued that it was her home too, and I told her that she had made it very clear she didn't want it to be anymore. The conversation turned desperate, then emotional, then manipulative, cycling through every tone I'd seen over the years, but none of it landed the way it used to. When she cried, it felt rehearsed. When she apologized, it sounded transactional. When she demanded, it reminded me exactly why I was done. Eventually she moved her foot, the door closed, and I watched through the window as she stood there, switching between anger and tears before finally leaving. I went back to my coffee, opened my laptop, and confirmed the appointment I'd already scheduled with a lawyer, feeling an unexpected sense of peace settle over me. The legal office was quiet and efficient, the kind of place that makes big life changes feel like paperwork instead of chaos. I explained exactly what had happened, not with drama but with dates, times, and details. The attorney listened, asked a few practical questions, and outlined my options in a voice that made everything sound manageable. There were no children, no shared debts, and the major assets were already in my name, which simplified things more than I'd expected. When he asked if I was sure I wanted to proceed, I told him that I was simply taking my spouse at her word, and he nodded like he'd heard that sentence more times than I could imagine. I left with a clear plan and a stack of documents, and when I got home, I found her waiting near my car, dressed carefully, hair done, expression soft in a way that used to work on me. She said we needed to talk, that she'd been thinking, that she'd made a mistake. I told her I'd already done my thinking, and that the next steps were already in motion. Her shock was almost genuine, or at least well acted. She tried to minimize what she'd done, blamed the atmosphere, the drinks, the crowd, anything except her own choices. I stepped away from her reach and asked whether disrespect was somehow supposed to be more acceptable when it was shared with friends. That question didn't have a good answer, and she didn't try to find one. She moved on to promises, to counseling, to the idea of us. But I reminded her that she had ended that idea herself, loudly and publicly. When that didn't work, she got angry, accused me of being cruel, of overreacting, of throwing everything away over one night. I told her that the night wasn't the cause, it was the proof. Eventually, she tried one last time to regain control by saying she wouldn't sign anything, and I explained, just as calmly, that she wouldn't have to for the process to move forward. A few days later, the paperwork found her at work, and although I wasn't there to see it, the town did what small towns always do. It talked. Strangers offered sympathetic looks, acquaintances asked careful questions, and the story began to circulate in versions that were a lot closer to the truth than the one she'd hoped would stick. I ran into one of her former friends by accident, and she admitted that what had happened that night had made everyone uncomfortable, that it had felt more like a performance than a mistake. Hearing that didn't make me feel vindicated. It just confirmed what I already knew. Even the people who had been part of the audience had seen the line get crossed. The difference was that I was the one who decided not to pretend it hadn't. As the weeks went by, the social support she expected started to thin out, while mine quietly grew. People treated me with a kind of respect I hadn't realized I'd been missing, and without the constant tension of trying to manage someone else's moods, my days felt simpler and lighter. I started taking better care of myself, going back to habits I'd abandoned, and noticing how much energy I'd been spending just keeping the peace. The house felt calmer, the finances felt easier, and for the first time in a long while, my future felt like something I was actually choosing instead of something I was just enduring. Every so often I'd hear another update about how hard things were for her, but each time I reminded myself that this wasn't cruelty. It was consequence, and there was a difference. By the time she tried to stage a very public conversation in a crowded restaurant, I was no longer surprised by the tactic, only by how predictable it had become. She chose a place full of familiar faces, sat down with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and spoke loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, talking about regret and love and second chances like she was reading from a script. I listened, let her finish, and then, just as calmly and just as publicly, repeated her own words back to her, explaining that I had simply believed what she'd said when she'd said it. The room grew quiet in that particular way that tells you people are listening, not for drama, but for clarity. When I stood up and left, I could hear the whispers start behind me, and I knew that whatever story she'd hoped to tell that day had just ended very differently. The aftermath of that restaurant scene moved through town faster than I expected, not in the form of gossip that felt cruel or sensational, but in the quieter way people adjust their behavior when they've seen enough to make up their minds. A few acquaintances reached out with cautious messages that were really just checking whether I was okay, and I found myself answering honestly for once instead of minimizing everything to keep the peace. It was strange how much lighter my days felt when I wasn't constantly bracing for the next argument or the next performance. I started spending my evenings differently, sometimes at the gym, sometimes just walking through neighborhoods I hadn't bothered to explore in years, realizing how much of my world had slowly shrunk to fit inside someone else's moods. Every so often, I'd hear that she was struggling, that she was angry at everyone, that she was telling and retelling the story in ways that painted her as the victim of sudden, inexplicable cruelty. But stories only work when people believe them, and belief has a way of fading when the facts keep bumping into it from every angle. The legal process moved forward with the steady, unromantic rhythm of paperwork and deadlines, and I found that I appreciated that more than I would have thought. There was something comforting about forms that didn't care about feelings or drama, only about signatures and dates and clear boundaries. When we sat in the same room for one of the required meetings, she looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way someone looks when the world stops rearranging itself around them. She tried once or twice to catch my eye, to start a conversation that might soften the edges of what was happening, but I kept my focus on the documents in front of me. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. Every time I'd softened in the past, it had only taught her that boundaries were temporary and negotiable. This time, I needed them to be solid. Without the constant drain of supporting someone who treated my effort like an unlimited resource, my finances stabilized in a way that felt almost unreal. I hadn't realized how much anxiety I carried about money until it was gone, until I could check my account without bracing myself for a surprise expense that I hadn't agreed to and couldn't question. I started planning things again, small at first, then a little bigger, not because I was trying to prove anything to anyone, but because I finally could. Even simple things, like buying something without wondering whether it would spark an argument later, felt like a quiet kind of freedom. The house reflected that change too, slowly becoming a place that felt like it belonged to me instead of a stage set for someone else's moods. She tried to reach out in different ways, some subtle, some not. There were messages sent from numbers I didn't recognize, comments passed through mutual acquaintances, even a few awkward encounters where she clearly hoped for a moment alone to restart a conversation that had already ended. Each time, I kept it brief and polite and distant, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I finally understood that distance was the only way to keep old patterns from reasserting themselves. There's a strange kind of courage in not engaging, in not defending yourself, in not trying to win an argument that doesn't need to exist anymore. Silence, I learned, can be a boundary just as strong as any locked door. When the final meeting with the attorneys arrived, it felt less like an ending and more like a confirmation of something that had already happened. The papers were laid out, the terms were clear, and there was no dramatic confrontation, no last-minute plea that could change the direction of things. She signed with a hand that shook just slightly, and I signed with a steadiness that surprised even me. Walking out of that office, I expected to feel either triumphant or devastated, but instead I felt calm, the way you feel after finally putting down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. The air outside seemed brighter, not because anything magical had changed, but because my perspective finally had. Life, as it turns out, doesn't transform overnight in cinematic ways, but in small, accumulative shifts that add up to something unrecognizable from where you started. I built routines that were mine, filled my weekends with things I actually enjoyed, and reconnected with people I'd slowly drifted away from without fully noticing. Some of them admitted gently that they'd kept their distance before because my relationship had always felt like walking into a storm cloud that might burst at any moment. Hearing that stung a little, but it also made sense. It's hard to maintain connections when you're constantly managing someone else's chaos. Now, those connections felt easier, lighter, more honest. Every now and then, I'd see her around town, usually from a distance, usually looking tired and preoccupied. The version of her I saw then didn't match the confident performer I remembered from that night when she'd turned our marriage into a story for laughs. I didn't feel satisfaction in that contrast, just a quiet understanding of how quickly things change when the safety net disappears. Consequences aren't loud or dramatic most of the time. They're persistent, showing up in everyday choices and everyday struggles, long after the audience has gone home. One afternoon, I ran into someone who had been part of that original group, and we exchanged a few polite words that eventually turned into an honest conversation. She told me that what had happened had made a lot of people rethink their own behavior, that seeing someone treat something so serious like entertainment had been uncomfortable in a way that lingered. I appreciated her telling me that, not because it validated my decision, but because it reminded me that sometimes boundaries don't just protect you, they show other people where the line should be too. We said goodbye, and I walked away feeling oddly grateful for a chapter of my life that had ended badly but taught me something I wouldn't have learned otherwise. The most surprising change wasn't external at all but internal. I stopped second-guessing myself. For years I'd been trained slowly and subtly to doubt my reactions, to assume that if something felt wrong, it was probably because I was being too sensitive or not trying hard enough. Now I trusted my own sense of where respect should begin and end. That didn't make me harder or colder. It made me clearer. And clarity, I realized, is a kind of kindness, especially to yourself. Looking back, I can see how close I came to accepting a life where being diminished was normal, where being the punchline was just part of the role I played. It's strange how easy it is to adapt to that kind of erosion, how you don't notice it happening until someone does something so extreme that it finally forces you to look at the whole picture. That night, when she made her announcement, felt catastrophic in the moment, but in hindsight, it was a strange kind of gift. It showed me the truth in a way I couldn't ignore, and it gave me a reason to act on it. People sometimes ask if I'm bitter, or if I wish things had turned out differently, and the honest answer is no. I wish I'd understood sooner what I understand now, but I don't wish the past away. It led me here, to a life that feels quieter, steadier, and more my own. I don't need a dramatic ending or a public victory to feel at peace with it. I just need to keep choosing the kind of life where respect isn't optional and dignity isn't something you negotiate for applause. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that when someone tells you clearly and publicly who they are and how they see you, the bravest thing you can do is believe them. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with action. Sometimes walking away isn't running from a problem, it's finally refusing to live inside it. And sometimes, the moment meant to embarrass you becomes the moment that sets you free.